For this week in China and the world, we'll be doing a debunk looking into wet markets and how a little history goes a long way. Proper debunk, we have to look into what is known in public perception as well as reflect upon a point of where you, the researcher, changed your perception. And also, we have to use the improved understanding to dig deeper into our vision of the present. We should begin by digging into the public perception of wet markets. Wet markets as a term are frequently conflated with live wildlife markets. The two terms do not actually mean necessarily the same thing. Nonetheless, National Geographic reported in April of 2020 that wet markets launched the coronavirus in a completely erroneous report. Sir Paul McCartney said, "Wet markets are medieval," right around the same time. Individuals also pointed to the conditions of animal equality and stated that wet markets were inhuman, and there was intensive suffering inflicted on farm animals, and that wet markets were a threat to public health. All of these were applied to live wildlife markets, but the term wet markets was used. So what is a wet market? The term wet markets came into usage in the English language in the early 1970s when the Singaporean government used the term to distinguish these markets from air-conditioned supermarkets that had become popular with the opening of Fitzpatrick's supermarket on Orchard Road in 1958. The original Geylang Serai market was opened on April 17th of 1975, pictured here. It was opened by then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, and the single-story market proved to be a very popular place with locals and tourists. During the Hari Raya period, a makeshift marketplace would be set up next to this indoor market. Another location, the Chongbun Market and Food Center, was built in 1979. It is one of the older market-cum-food centers in Ang Mo Kio. It has 28 food stalls and about 184 market stalls. Since its opening, it has been the preferred venue of walkabouts conducted by many members of parliament and cabinet ministers. The Hawker Center, which is part of this location, is pictured here. The Hawker Center also focuses on a place, one particular stall called Yongsin. It's a famous place which specializes in bok chor mee, which is essentially minced pork noodles tossed in a dressing made of lard and vinegar, chili, garlic, braised shiitake mushrooms, and other condiments, including toasted pi he, which is a dried leatherjacket fish. So why are these wet markets called wet markets? In a dry market, a dry grocery store or shopping center, there were only non-perishable foods in the 1950s and through the 1970s. Perishable foods had to be kept cool to be sanitary. Ice was therefore shipped in to keep food from spoiling. What happens to ice when it melts? Well, the melting ice went right onto the floor and created a wet floor. Fresh produce was also sprayed daily and throughout the day with clean water to keep it sanitary and prevent it from spoiling. As you are spraying more water on the produce, what happens to the remainder of the water? Well, it goes on the floor. The floors were also washed down at the beginning and end of every day to clean the marketplace. More water and more wetness. Depending on how you back-translate the terms, the term public market may be synonymous with wet market, especially in translating from Cantonese, although it may sometimes refer to exclusively state-owned and community-owned wet markets, especially in the states of Vietnam, Laos, and the People's Republic of China. Wet markets may also be called fresh food markets and good food markets when referring to those markets consisting of numerous competing vendors primarily selling fruits and vegetables. The term wet market is frequently used to signify also a live animal market that sells directly to consumers, but most often this refers to fish. although the terms are not necessarily synonymous. In fact, when I recall hearing the term wet market very distinctly in 2015 in Laos, I actually stopped because I was confused as to what the term meant. The person who I was working with asked if I'd ever been to a wet market before. I presumed I had because I'd been living in Southeast Asia for several years at that point. But I searched the terms that I knew in Vietnamese. Back in my mind, I had Chua Kho, which is of course a dry market, and then the other term for market, Chua Ka Tui Som, a live fish market. Between a dry market and a live fish market, I assumed that maybe the fish market was the wet one, but there wasn't really a term in Vietnamese for what I thought was being described in English. So I searched backwards mentally through my French vocabulary. Marché humide, that must be wet. Marché sec, that must be dry. But this is just like the terms in English. In fact, the terms in French were probably just translated from Singaporean English. So I turned to Cambodian. Reaching back through the Cambodian vocabulary, I just ended up with Psa. Psa is, of course, the Cambodian or Khmer translation of bazaar from Arabic. Didn't really distinguish, or I couldn't recall distinguishing between wet and dry markets. So I asked my colleague who's working there what wet market really meant, and then he just said there were live animals there. We went to the marketplace and I saw what was a marketplace. Flowers for sale, fresh vegetables were for sale, and down along the way you might find some fresh fish. Of course, we were in Laos, so quite far inland. And yes, there was like a lizard here and there, but that was mostly to excite potential tourists. So why all the fuss about wet markets? Well, in fact, individuals who are political figures in the United States were just capitalizing upon a public perception that didn't really understand previously reported scientific facts from the People's Republic of China. After the avian flu H5N1 spread from 2005 through 2008, the PRC banned live poultry from wet markets and traditional marketplaces. In fact, most live animal markets in the PRC today only have live fish or other seafood options, very similar to seafood markets in the United States or Western Europe. Markets, however, are gathering places. Therefore, if you had a large group of people all gathered together and one of them was sick with a very communicable disease, where the virulence factor of that disease, the ability of that disease to spread, was quite high, you could have a super spreader event. The current hypothesis is this is what appears to have happened at Wuhan, South China seafood market back in early 2020. So there are other features of this story that we can myth bust. Individuals might recall that there was a potential link between bats and humans, and then there are all these images circulated of bats being sold in marketplaces, which is of course completely ridiculous. In fact, the current scientific consensus is that there is in fact an intermediary species between bats and humans, and that bats are actually a very common reservoir for a load of different coronaviruses. But the bat hypothesis is actually linked to a scientific study that is being misinterpreted, but it was published in 2007. The scientific study referred to horseshoe bats, which have, across several different types, a range that stretches from Western Europe to Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia, including parts of Northern Africa, referring to these bats as a ticking time bomb. The origins of the coronavirus, really SARS-CoV-2, which is a specific type of coronavirus, have also been in conspiracy theories linked to laboratories or People's Republic of China governmental mistakes. In fact, neither of these are true. The origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus are still actually disputed, although we do know that the earliest sample comes from wastewater in March 2019 from Barcelona, Spain. If you reflect on the history of the H1N1 epidemic in the early 20th century. And we'll also note that there are disputed origins for the origins of the pandemic, which is why it's very important to note that treating a pandemic is much more important than figuring out where the specific origins of the disease were. There has also been a discussion of contestation between provincial level, Hubei provincial level governmental structures, which attempted to play down the severity of the virus at first, and national governmental structures of the People's Republic of China, which responded in a relatively effective fashion. Of course, one might directly parallel this to certain states in the United States which have had very little impact in terms of being successful because they have just utterly failed to address the severity of the virus, and the national government of the United States, which has also been, frankly, completely ineffective. Another important aspect that digs deeply into history and is in fact a common theme when we find diseases is the discussion of the effectiveness of travel bans. There has been some discussion about whether or not travel bans are effective, and you might look backwards to instances of plague that appeared in Chinatowns in the United States and the response to those in the 20th century. Very little evidence exists to suggest that travel bans are actually an effective means of preventing disease spread. In fact, any benefit is really just temporary and related to the flow of humans and the ability to track disease spread. And of course, putting up a travel ban itself, based on the type of passport that one uses, is completely ineffective. This was already proven in a study by Nicole Arrett, who is a lecturer at the University of Washington, Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, and colleagues of hers at Johns Hopkins University in a research study that was actually published in January of 2020 in the Journal of Emergency Management. The research suggested that, contrary to public perception, travel bans were completely ineffective, but in reality what was much more effective was things like wearing a mask, things like doing contact tracing, rigorous testing regimes, and so forth. This is all to say that if you are looking at historical examples in the deep history of wet markets, just remember that what you see in terms of wet markets portrayed, where you have bats in the markets that are being sold to tourists to get a rise out of them, versus the reality of the close relationship between humans and their food. In fact, if you wanted to look for unsanitary conditions where humans live in close proximity to food, you wouldn't have to look that far. All you'd have to do is look at the map on the right-hand side of the slide and note where all the factory farms in the United States are located today. This being said, for your post, why don't you just focus on something that was surprising about this history and this debunk? And for your work this week, you will continue to discuss this topic in this discussion post, but also you will be finishing up a rough draft of your research papers. So keep up the good work and stay tuned.